Hi, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the Backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the upcoming book, The Only Witness. It's a historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. And today, this is going to be a very special podcast. We're not only going to learn about the Shroud, but also funeral practices, and especially from the the National Museum of Funeral History. And for that, we have two people on the call, which is also very special. We have Nora Creech, a longtime syndicalist, and we have Genevieve Keeney, who is the president and CEO of the museum. So with that, let me introduce both of them and give you a short background. So Nora Creech, as I mentioned, has been interested in the Shroud since the 1970s and has extensively studied this linen cloth. As an experienced lecturer on the history, science, and pastoral implications of the Shroud, she is passionate about sharing the facts about the mysterious image and connecting it to the gospel message. Nora earned her Master's of Arts degree in Faith and Culture from the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, and has attended year-long courses in Shroud Studies offered by the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum in Rome, Italy. She is working with the National Museum of Funeral History in Houston to develop an exhibit on the most famous burial of all time, the Shroud of Turin, which will open to the public on April 27th in just a few short weeks. We also have Genevieve Keeney, and she has been with the National Museum of Funeral History, NMFH, in Houston since 2007. First serving as the museum's director in 2007, then president and chief operating officer in 2012, and currently she is the president and chief executive officer. She proudly showcases the museum as an educational and cultural resource for all who visit its extensive array of permanent and changing exhibits. Keeney, and her last name is actually Keeney-Vazquez, sees the NMFH as a living museum about the culture of funerals throughout history as well as modern times. Death is sure to happen to all of us, yet most of us don't plan for it, says Keeney. The museum is a neutral place to ponder and discuss this guaranteed event, as well as explore the history of the industry, and there's so much to learn at this museum. Genevieve, Nora, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Good to have both of you. So let's start with Nora. So Nora, tell us your backstory on the Shroud of Turin, and then also a little bit more about how you got involved in the National Museum of Funeral History.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And as you said in the introduction, I've been interested in the Shroud since the 1970s. I was a teenager in high school in 1978 when the STURP team did their famous studies in Turin, so the Shroud of Turin Research Project Team. And it turned out that one of the scientists on that team was a member of the church that I attended growing up in Boulder, Colorado. His name is Rudy. And Rudy, once he came back from being a part of the STURP team, he started giving lectures in the Boulder area. And every time he gave a lecture, my father and I would attend. So this was back in 78, 79, 1980, before any of the STURP team papers were published. So Rudy was a professor at the University of Colorado, and if I needed to write a research paper, I would go visit Rudy in his office, and he would give me information that I could include for my research papers as a college student. So long-term interest in the Shroud. And I started becoming more interested when my own children were learning about their faith, and they were going through the confirmation program at our church. And I thought it would be a good idea to offer the Shroud Studies course for the confirmation students, because the teenagers were very interested in learning about the passion and death of Jesus and how it's documented on the Shroud, and then making the connection between the Shroud and the resurrection and what that means for our faith. So starting in the early 2000s, I started giving lectures for the high school kids, and then that grew into lectures for the adults in our church community. So that's a little bit of the background of where I've been doing my shroud work.
Oh, fantastic. And then how did you get connected with the National Museum of Funeral History?
Well, that's a long story. Genevieve can help me tell this story. So in 2018, I was living in Houston. I had finished my master's degree in faith and culture, and I was looking around for ways to share my faith. And that was the goal of the faith and culture degree, was to equip lay people to be able to share their faith in their communities. And so the idea was that we were empowered to be vocal witnesses in the community. So I was looking at what that would mean for me. And I came across this course through the Regina Apostolorum, which is the Pontifical University in Rome, Italy. And they were offering a course in shroud studies, and it was being offered for the first time in English. And of course, this all was distance learning. So it was a year-long course, 2 full semesters of coursework. And it was the first time it was offered in English. Well, it turned out that there were only 2 people in the English language course in 2018, and we both happened to live in Houston. And so Father Dalton, who's one of the instructors in the course, recognized that we were both in Houston and introduced us to each other. And he was at that time a transitional deacon, Deacon Jared, and he was also living in Houston. And he made a trip to visit the museum, and he actually literally ran into Genevieve in the museum. And I'm going to let her tell that portion of the story, because this is how we got to know each other.
Yeah, so Genevieve, tell us that. It sounds fascinating, and Father Dalton is certainly an interesting person to get to know.
Oh, yes, I have to speak to Father Dalton. He is amazing. He has a wealth of knowledge, and just I don't know. It's just his approach and the way he speaks about the shroud. It really is. It's not only uplifting, but it's powerful and rememberable. You know, and actually, we have on our website one of his lectures that he gave on the shroud. So anybody listening wants to hear one of Father Dalton's lectures, please, visit the website and you can see it on the shroud page. But how did Deacon Jared and I, come to meet? I find the story very fascinating, because as the president of the museum, my job now is primarily administrative, being, in my office, 8 to 10 hours a day, and not so much out on the museum floor itself. Early on, when I was curating exhibits or overseeing the expansion of the museum, of course, I was out on the floor of the museum quite often. You could find me there. But since all that has taken place, my new job now is back in my office. And so it's still to this day, I could not tell you what brought me into the museum, but something pulled me into the museum itself. And as I was walking down one of the main, walk areas of the museum, I ran into Deacon Jared, and I saw him. And of course, I asked him a question of the Pope exhibit. And I said, well, how did you enjoy the Pope exhibit? Because, of course, whenever we have people of religion to come and actually tour the exhibit, I always like to approach them and get some feedback, just to kind of validate its existence and its purpose on educating those in the faith. And so him and I engaged in conversation, and he then looked at me and said, have you ever thought of bringing the Shroud of Turin here? And I said, no, I don't know, but maybe let's talk more about it. And so when he said it, I had a small sense of familiarity to the wording of the Shroud of Turin, but in my mind, it wasn't popping, like I really knew what he was talking about. And so, for lack of appearing ignorant to him, I just said, yes, can we still talk more about this? I am interested in what you had to say. And of course, I just went back and validated what the Shroud of Turin was in my mind with what I thought it was, to ensure I was understanding what it was that he was wanting me to discuss further about and bring to the museum. And I thought, wow, this is an amazing piece. How is this ever going to get to the National Museum of Funeral History? I was, I'm always up for a challenge. I'm always up for new ideas when it comes to curating exhibits. And so I said, well, let's talk further. And so then he introduced me to Nora, and the three of us sat down and brainstormed about the concept of an exhibit to the Shroud of Turin. But most importantly, how do we get our hands on a copy of the Shroud of Turin? And so it's been quite a journey over the last, 3 years now, to get where we are today. And, many of times we've had challenges and we've had roadblocks and we've had so many obstacles thrown our way. But our faith, our perseverance, our determination, and our trust in each other has got us where we are today, and to actually see this exhibit open.
Yeah, it really is amazing. And to actually have the exhibit there, when you were asked the question, what would it be like to have the Shroud of Turin? I thought, oh my God, it's the original as opposed to a replica, an exact copy. And now that would, that's fascinating. And the copies that are out there nowadays are just incredibly good. I've seen the one that's up in the museum, was up in the Museum of the Bible, and it is just it's awe-inspiring. And I mean, just the shroud itself is just awe-inspiring. So, but let's step back a second. So, what was the background and history of the funeral museum? What actually led to its inception and now its continued growth and existence?
The museum opened in 1992 in Houston. However, years prior to that, Mr. R.L. Waltrip, God rest his soul, who unfortunately passed away last night. I find it very ironic that we're able to sit here and continue his legacy like this. And I'm greatly appreciative of it. Interesting talking about him in this moment because, all this time I've done these interviews and he's been present. And now I have to change my verbiage and talk in past tense. So please forgive me if I transposition from present to past. So in many years before 1992, Mr. Waltrip, who grew one of the largest funeral corporations in the world, as he was on that journey, he began to see a lot of the amazing tools of our trade, the items that were very significant to our practice of caring for the dead, being discarded in the landfills. Because what are you going to do with an embalming machine that was once used on somebody? What are you going to do with a cooling board or a hearse? And, these items, very significant to our profession, were, unless you had a special niche for them in your life, they really, truly just became trash. Nobody wanted them. And so he saw that as an opportunity to create the museum as a place to house these tools of our trade and the history of how we have evolved and the major undertaking that actually goes into caring for our dead that people don't realize. And that's how the museum came to be. Was an opportunity to do just that, to preserve our industry and our profession and speak to it and the history of it, because we've been caring for the dead since the day we began living. And so rightfully so. And the museum has been here in Houston since 1992. We're going on over 30 years of existence now. And we are constantly growing as we're privately funded. I have to raise all the money for the museum. So each year, as we are able to meet our financial raising goals, it allows us to just do a little bit more for the museum. And we're really excited to bring the Shroud to the museum. And a lot of people might not understand initially when you see those two together, the National Museum of Funeral History and the Shroud of Turin. It's almost like vinegar and water to some people if you don't. But if you really think about it, it's not. It's very much water and water, and mixes very well together, because in death we do seek our religion. In death, we tend to use the religion as our guide to our practices when we die. And then, of course, Jesus himself, the man of the shroud, he died. And because of his death, he was buried, just as we all will die and be buried. And it's hand in hand, water and water.
Yeah, absolutely. It really, I really found that an interesting piece of, bringing the two together. Let me switch over to Nora. So Nora, what was kind of the inspiration, and how did the whole process unfold as you and Genevieve worked together to bring the shroud to the museum?
Well, we were very much guided by the people at Athonia, where Father Dalton is a part of Athonia, and they helped us to go through the process of requesting the certified copy. So it had to come from the head of the Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston, who is Cardinal DiNardo. And so I wrote a letter for Cardinal DiNardo's signature to send to the Archbishop of Turin, requesting an official copy. And we sent that, I think we sent it in 2019. And
yes.
we thought we were going to be opening an exhibit sometime in 2020. We had our capital campaign plan to be kicked off in March of 2020. And of course, the whole world shut down in March of 2020. And I subsequently moved from Houston to California, and a lot of the world was quiet for a long period of time. But as we came out of hibernation, Genevieve and I touched base, and she said she was still really committed to the exhibit. And of course, I really wanted to see it happen, being a Shroudie. And so we started reaching out again about the status of this copy that we had requested. And I want to say part of the excitement of having an exhibit on the shroud in the funeral museum is that it's a secular space. And most of the shroud exhibits are in sacred spaces. And so to have Cardinal DiNardo sign a letter on our behalf, attesting to the funeral museum being a good place to house a shroud exhibit, that really meant a lot to us, to Genevieve and to me, that we could have an exhibit in a secular space. So a whole different group of people would be exposed to the shroud than the normal people who learn or seek out the shroud. So as time passed, we finally got a letter earlier in 2022 that we were getting a very special shroud replica. So we got one of the replicas on old linen, just like the one that's at the Museum of the Bible. I think there are only 7 of them in the world. And so one of them will be installed at the National Museum of Funeral History. And I say these are really special copies because all the while that the world was shut down due to COVID, this flax was growing in a field in Bergamo, Italy. And this flax was grown from heirloom flax seeds that had been stored in the seed vault, the International Seed Vault. And then when the flax was harvested, it was harvested using first century techniques. And then it was woven into thread, and then the thread was woven into the linen. And then on this old linen, they used a high definition printer and printed an exact copy of what the shroud looks like on this linen. And it is absolutely beautiful. And we're so thrilled and privileged to have it. And so that was really the first piece that once we knew we had our shroud replica, we were in business and very excited. And then the most recent piece is that we have a commitment to purchase one of Luigi Mattei's bronze sculptures of the Man of the Shroud. And we're hoping it will make it in time for the grand opening, but it'll be close. But we have a benefactor who is paying for us to have that beautiful sculpture be a part of the exhibit. And then the third thing I want to mention is that Rudy Dictel, who was the inspiration for me learning about the shroud, he donated to us all of his personal artifacts from his time as a member of the STIRP team. And so when Genevieve and I were going through the boxes of what Rudy donated to us, there were a lot of treasures in there. But a couple of things that stood out were he had some of the mylar, which covered the examination table that the STIRP team built specially to examine the shroud, because they wanted to make sure there wasn't any chance of any kind of interaction between the examination table and the shroud. So they covered it with this mylar, which was donated from NASA. And so we were very excited about that because the museum is in Houston and we have this connection with NASA, and we can show how stringent the scientists were in their examination of the shroud. We also have from the personal collection of Barry Schwartz, one of the magnets that was used to hold the shroud to the examination table. And then also from the Stera collection, we have the torque applicator that was used to take the sticky tape samples from the STIRP time. So we have a lot of treasures in this exhibit for everyone who comes to see it.
Well, that's phenomenal. You know, all of those little pieces that that you've been able to recover and have in there, and then now for safekeeping with the museum. So is the exhibit now, is it going to be permanent, or is it going to be just a temporary, or how do you see the future for the Shroud exhibit?
Definitely permanent.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great because unfortunately I won't get down there this year, I don't think, but I am going to get down there, and so I definitely want to see it and what have you. I was privileged to be able to get up to the Museum of the Bible and see that one, and now just you know, one of the things that I found when just sitting and standing in front of that replica of the shroud, it is just it's I don't know, I don't even know how to describe it. It's awe-inspiring, but it's also very calming, and looking forward to the same experience then coming down to visit the National Museum of Funeral History. So let me switch over to let's see here, to Genevieve. So let's talk a little bit about the museum overall. What are some of the other interesting exhibits that really are what people are flocking to see when they come to the museum?
Definitely the cremation exhibit. That exhibit was a long time, was long overdue. Let's put it that way. Many people would come to the museum and say, "Why isn't there anything on cremation here that we can learn about?" And so we, collaborated with Kena, and it took us about 2 years from concept to actual opening to create a very well respected cremation exhibit that I think, helps people to understand that, they do have choices to make. It's burial or it's cremation. And if you make the choice of cremation, there are many options that are still available to you once you have been cremated that people aren't aware of, and a lot of times don't learn of until they're at a funeral home and learning of this. And unfortunately, they're learning it during a time of grief. So it makes it even more cumbersome to comprehend some of the things that you could do to memorialize your loved one. And so I think the museum, does a fascinating job to help people to take a look at not only the practices of the funeral director, understanding what our role is in caring for their loved one, but know that planning for your funeral is important. And because there are so many options available to you, there's so many questions and decisions that have to be made that people may not realize. And so the museum's a wonderful place for that. And our international hall is also very fascinating. We talk about different funeral customs and rituals from around the world. Our largest exhibit is housed there is the Celebrating the Lives and Deaths of the Pope. And we talk about all of the popes going all the way back to the first pope. And we showcase the rituals and the customs that still continue on hundreds of years later, whereas the American way of dying, if you will, or some of our other cultural ways tends to change over time based on the expectations of the people. and what they want or what they're willing to do or what their expectations are. Another thing that you really can see an upward trend of is the embalming and or the cremation, just because we're more of a transportable society now. We're all over the world, but technology has brought us together. So you could be somewhere else, but yet still attend your loved one's funeral. Whereas before that might not have been possible before technology. And so the art of embalming would help preserve your loved one until the arrangements could be made and people could come in and be a part of the closing ceremony of the funeral, as well as being able to transport that person who has passed away to the location of their final resting place. You know, just so many things have transformed and changed as our society continued to be more transportable and spread out throughout the world.
Yeah, I know my partner, I think it was his wife's, one of his parents passed away during COVID, and the funeral was held over Zoom, except for the closest family members. And so, and I can't remember where the funeral was going to be. There was no flying. So they were stuck in North Carolina, and the funeral, I think, was up in New York or something like that. And they were not able to attend it other than through Zoom. So you're right. The technology has certainly changed a lot of things. Now, I did notice on your website that you also have something about the cremations on the island of Bali. And, you know, you never think about other cultures like that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that right now is still an article that Mr. Bedeker, who's now our chairman, he wrote the article, and we're currently working on the paneling for that to be housed within the museum. You can read about it on the website, but it'll be another couple of months before those panels are installed, and you can actually read about those specific traditions. And yeah, so you know, there's little pockets of the world that we're still like discovering as you know, myself, the curator, or Mr. Bedeker, you know, our chairman, you know, just it's the curious mind wants to know. And so as you begin the research and see the different customs and traditions, once we find them, we try and put them together in a very educational way and bring it to the museum, so that once again people can expand their mind and realize that there's so many interesting ways that people care for the dead throughout the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, so let me come back to Nora a second. You know, you mentioned some of the things that you had from Rudy Dichtel, and you talked about the Mylar. From his papers and other things, what did you find was the most interesting that you were able to glean out of, I'm sure, boxes and boxes of really fascinating stuff?
Yes, he sent us quite a few boxes, and there were in there the manuals that were developed when the STRP team was put together. They planned for 18 months before they went over to Turin. And they actually met in person in a hotel and talked through all of the tests that they would be doing, because every minute of the 120 hours that they had for studies was planned. And so we have the manuals that were his personal manuals for the STRP team. And Rudy's job on the STRP team was to set up all of the equipment and make sure it kept running. And that was really no small task, because it was in an old palace that didn't have all of the electrical connections that you might need. And it also didn't have the same electricity. So he had to really be handy to get all of the equipment set up and to keep it running for the full time of the STRP studies.
So was he setting the equipment up prior to the 120 hours, or did he then, his setup started with the 120 hours?
That's a good question. We have him coming to Houston for the grand opening, and we're having an evening on the 27th that we're calling an evening with the experts. And it's going to be a conversation between Rudy and also Barry Schwartz, who was the documenting photographer for the STRP study. And we're planning to have a conversation between the two of them. And that is a great question. I'm going to put that on my list to ask them. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I do remember you mentioned Barry Schwartz. I've spoken with him and interviewed him, and I do remember him saying that all of the boxes of equipment got held up because there was one box, I think that was an X-ray machine and had then that nuclear or whatever it is warning sign on it, and that held up the all of the equipment for quite a while, and so they were really rushed trying to set things up. So
Mhm.
yeah, definitely. I don't know, maybe I will try and get out there for the opening. I went up to Washington, D.C. Houston is not harder to get to, so maybe I'll come out and meet you all and go from there.
Well, we would love to have you. We're very excited about this, and Rudy and Barry are both excited to be there and to be a part of it. And we really have appreciated their support and encouragement.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Genevieve, let me come back to you. So, when they come to the museum, and you've kind of touched on this, and the visitor leaves the museum, what do you want them to come home with? What is the one overriding thing that you want them to come home with?
To have a better sense of appreciation for life, because life is not guaranteed, and it's very finite, and to know that it's precious, and to just live a fuller life, because we will all die one day. That's one thing that none of us will ever be able to get out of, and to be able to if you can plan a little bit of what you want your funeral to look like, take that burden off of your family members and have those hard conversations. If I can, have a little personal experience at how this hard conversation can take place. I had a personal experience today. I had a couple of personal experiences today, but I'm taking my father to a medical procedure today, and we are sitting in the waiting room. And he said, well, before we left, he said, if anything happens to me, you need this, and this is what you need to know. And I said, okay. So now we're in the waiting room waiting for him to be called. And he says, well, if anything happens to me, I said, I know, Dad, you want to be cremated. And he goes, yes. And I said, oh, and by the way, I was thinking, maybe we should have a family plot at the Woodlands. And I'm going to take you to the Woodlands, okay, just so you know. And, because, the grandkids, they really probably don't want to have all of our urns of ashes, in a couple of years. That's not fair to the grandkids. I said, so I think we really need to take an opportunity to figure out where we want to put all the family's urns of ashes. And he said, that's a really good idea. But it was such a simple conversation in a very neutral space of a doctor's office. But I walked away knowing that if something happened to my father in that moment, by the time I had gotten back, I knew exactly what he wanted. And that was important to me.
No, and I agree. I absolutely understand. It's nice to know what their wishes are, and
Yes.
beforehand, so that you can definitely have certainty, because there's so much uncertainty going on when the moment arises, and the grief, and just being able to think straight. And it's nice to have certain things clearly defined. Thank you for that. Nora, how about you on the Shroud of Turin exhibit? What do you want people to come away with after they've visited it and been able to experience that this wonderful new exhibit?
Well, I think we're going to have a variety of different kinds of visitors. We're going to have people that have never heard of the Shroud before. So they're going to be learning about it for the very first time. So I want those people to leave with a real sense of curiosity about what is this ancient fabric and who was the man who was wrapped in it. And so there will be a lot of curiosity and desire to learn more. I also think we're going to have people that will actually make pilgrimages to come, people who are familiar with the Shroud. And like you, they want to come and to see these things because they've heard about the beautiful reproduction. They've heard about the Luigi Mattei sculpture. We also have some of Barry Schwartz's black and white images, the life-size black and white images that are the photographic negative images. And so people will be very curious who already know about the Shroud to come and see those items in person. In addition to what I've already described, we're going to have some of the the weapons that were used in the crucifixion. We have some nails and the cap of thorns, a reproduction of the flagrum, and also of the Roman spear. So it's an opportunity for people who want to learn more about what the Gospels tell us about the suffering that Jesus endured for us. And it'll be an opportunity for people to meditate on Christ. And then, of course, we want people to leave with the realization that the shroud image was created at the moment of resurrection. So it's leaving with a sense of hope and with an understanding that what the Gospels tell us is true, because we have the document in the scriptures, and then we have the monument with the shroud that shows that what Jesus said was really the truth, and that we can put our hope and our faith in the resurrection of Jesus. And then what he promised for us is that we would share in that life with him.
Yeah, that is such a powerful message, and that is so true. You brought up, though, early on there, that a lot of people have not heard of the Shroud of Turin. I was at a networking event, and there were a handful of Christians that were promoting Christian networking, a Christian networking association. And when I mentioned, well, this is what I'm working on, and I'm putting this book together on the Shroud of Turin, every one of them, they were all under 30 probably, but every one of them said, "What's that?" And so even there's a huge Christian community that doesn't even know what it is. So kudos to you in terms of bringing that message to, and that knowledge of first of all, of the proof of the resurrection, or the almost proof of the resurrection, depends on how you want to put it. But the proof of the resurrection, and then, like you said, the hope that comes out of that.
Genevieve and I have been doing lectures together in Houston since, I think, maybe 2020. We've gone all over the city of Houston talking about the shroud together. And often people come up to me and say, "Why has nobody ever told me about this before?" And especially the young people, they have no knowledge of the shroud. And I feel a real sense of responsibility for sharing the message of the shroud, and especially sharing it with young people. And I'm so grateful to Genevieve that she also has this vision, and she's been willing to set aside the space, to provide the funding, to provide the ongoing care for this exhibit. And I'm just so grateful that the people of Houston and all the visitors will have the opportunity to see this exhibit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful. So unfortunately, it's coming to a close. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention before we actually close?
I mean, I not so much mentioned, but you kind of opened up a little question that I have is, I now want to know, why do not so many people know about it? Because even when I was asked by now Father Jared, Deacon Jared at the time, when I was asked if, would I bring an exhibit on the Shroud of Turin to Houston, I too was faced in that moment of, I've heard of it, but I don't know if I'm truly thinking of what he's speaking to. And so, with that being said, is why is it that so many people don't know about it?
Yeah. Well, I think, and I hate to say it, I think that, I've talked about it so much, but that 1988 radiocarbon dating was such a travesty. And it really turned even syndenologists and shroudies, it turned a lot of them off. And I know even myself, I'd heard about Stirp and kind of read something in a magazine or whatever, and I said, "Oh, that's really interesting." And then when that radiocarbon dating came out and the press that surrounded that, I says, I guess it's a fake. And it was only really maybe 10 years ago that my brother then sent me a book, one of the Ian Wilson books, and that kind of got me back into it. Otherwise, I might never have even gotten involved in it. One of the other things I've found is, as I'm doing these podcasts and video casts and getting involved in knowing more people, there is definitely a lot more activity generally online, and so I think the word is starting to get out, and hopefully as that snowball starts to really roll, that over the next years and decades that it will really become known by just about everyone.
Mhm. I hope you're right, because it's such a fascinating topic, and there's so many ways you can study the shroud. And for me, the interest for me is the theological meaning of the shroud and the wounds of the shroud that are depicted on the shroud. But other people have interest in many different aspects of the shroud.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the pastoral side, and then even the scientific side, and the historical side. It's just there's so much there. It's just amazing, and looking forward to learning more every day.
Yeah, and then the history of the funeral side, right? I mean,
Yeah.
truthfully, he was prepared. His body was prepared in a shroud, as we still see that being done today in funeral practices, and placed in a tomb, a place of burial, and we still do that today. So even from the history of the funeral industry, it's a very fascinating study, if you will, to look back on and see how far that tradition has come, even from that time period to today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me close there. I want to thank both of you so much for being and participating in this podcast, and helping me to understand a little bit more about, certainly a lot more about the museum. And it's always interesting to see how the funeral practices, and like you mentioned, that we're still burying folks in shrouds even today, and putting them into burial places like a tomb and what have you. And so thank you so much for that. And thank you for participating again. Where can people get more information about the museum and also about the shroud?
The people can learn more about the museum through our website at nmfh.org. And Nora?
And the best website for shroud information is still run by Barry Schwartz. It's shroud.com. It's the first, the oldest, and the most visited website about the shroud. And just about anything you would want to discover is available there. The thing I love about Barry's website, though, is he is very careful to make sure that all the information that's on there is accurate. And so it's a great resource for people wanting to learn about the shroud.
Yeah, thank you for that. So NMFH, National Museum of Funeral History.org, NMFH. And then, of course, Barry Schwartz's shroud.com. And to your point, shroud.com, there's so much out there that you'll never be able to read it all. And I will admit, I think Barry has read everything, or just about everything. And so he is a wealth of great information. nmfh.org, shroud.com. And otherwise, please stay tuned for many other videos in this series of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. And if you get a chance, please visit GuyPowell.com and sign up for more episodes. And if you like this one, please rate it with 5 stars. Thank you so much, Genevieve. Thank you so much, Nora.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.